Let's start with something most people misunderstand about avoidance. Their silence is not peace, and their detachment is not strength. In the beginning, it looks like they've moved on effortlessly. No emotional outbursts, no visible regret, no urgency to repair what was broken. And if you're the one who was hurt, that can feel deeply unfair. You're processing, healing, questioning, while they appear untouched. But what you're witnessing is not resolution, it's suppression. Avoidants are highly skilled at disconnecting from emotional discomfort. It's not that they don't feel, it's that they've trained themselves not to feel in real time. Psychologically, this is a defense mechanism rooted in protection. At some point in their life, vulnerability became associated with pain, rejection, or loss of control. So they adapted. They learned to shut the door before anything could get too close. And when betrayal happens, instead of confronting guilt or remorse, they compartmentalize it. They bury it. They move forward as if nothing significant occurred. But here's where karma begins to take effect, not as punishment, but as consequence. Because emotions that are buried don't disappear, they accumulate. And what starts as numbness slowly begins to fracture. At first, it's subtle. Moments of restlessness, a thought that lingers longer than it should, a memory that interrupts their routine. They might dismiss it, distract themselves, keep moving, but the mind has a way of circling back to what hasn't been resolved. The more they try to suppress it, the more persistent it becomes. Over time, that emotional numbness they relied on starts to crack. And when it does, it doesn't open gently. It breaks under pressure. Because now, it's not just one feeling they have to face. It's all of it at once. The guilt they avoided. The connection they dismissed. The truth they refused to acknowledge. It surfaces in waves, often when they least expect it. Late at night, in quiet moments, in the absence of distraction. This is the part people don't see. They don't see the internal conflict, the contradiction between the image of control they project and the emotional chaos they're trying to contain. They don't see how exhausting it becomes to keep pretending you're unaffected when internally something is unraveling. And here's the deeper reality. Emotional suppression doesn't just delay pain, it amplifies it. Because when you refuse to process something honestly, you lose the ability to integrate the experience. You don't grow from it. You don't learn from it. You carry it. And eventually it starts affecting everything. Your thoughts, your relationships, your sense of self. So when that numbness cracks, it's not random. It's the psyche demanding resolution. It's the mind saying, you can't run from this anymore. And that's when the avoidant is forced into a space they've spent their entire life trying to avoid. True emotional confrontation. Not with you necessarily, but with themselves. And that's where karma becomes undeniable, because the very strategy they use to escape pain becomes the reason they feel it more intensely later on. What they avoided doesn't disappear, it waits. And when it returns, it doesn't ask for permission. At some point, everyone has to face what they chose to ignore. And once that internal numbness begins to fracture, something even more confronting starts to take its place. Your absence. Not your presence, not your words, not the memories in their idealized form, but the undeniable, lived reality that you are no longer there. Because here's the truth. When you were in their life, you represented more than just a person. You represented emotional consistency, understanding, patience, things they may not have fully recognized at the time. Avoidants have a tendency to downplay what they have while they have it. It's easier to minimize value than to risk dependence. So they convince themselves that what you offered was replaceable, that the connection wasn't as deep as it actually was, that walking away wouldn't carry any real cost. But absence has a way of revealing what presence concealed. At first, they may experience relief. Space feels safe. Distance feels like control. There's no pressure to respond, no expectation to be vulnerable, no mirror reflecting back the parts of themselves they struggle to face. And in that phase, they tell themselves they made the right decision. But over time, something shifts, because the human mind is not designed to ignore meaningful connections indefinitely. What was once familiar becomes noticeably missing. The conversations that grounded them, the emotional stability you brought, the subtle ways you understood them without explanation, those things don't get replaced easily. And when they're gone, their absence becomes louder than any conflict that once existed. This is where karma quietly takes hold. Not through dramatic events, but through realization. They begin to notice that the spaces you used to fill are still empty. They may try to distract themselves, new people, new routines, constant movement, but none of it carries the same emotional depth. And that's when comparison begins. Not always consciously, but internally. They start measuring new experiences against what they had with you. And for the first time, they're not minimizing it, they're recognizing it. There's also a psychological principle at play here. We often don't fully process the value of something until it's no longer accessible. When something is available, the mind takes it for granted. But when it's removed, the brain begins to reconstruct it, often with greater clarity and honesty. The flaws become less significant. The meaning becomes more defined. And this is particularly intense for avoidants, because your absence removes their ability to stay in control of the narrative. When you were there, they could create distance, regulate interaction, and maintain emotional safety on their terms. But once you're gone, truly gone, they lose that control. They can't reach out without confronting vulnerability. They can't reconnect without acknowledging what they walked away from. So instead, they sit with it, the silence, the distance, the awareness that something real existed, and they chose to let it go. And here's the deeper layer most people overlook. It's not just about missing you. It's about what your absence represents. It represents a missed opportunity for growth, a reflection of their own limitations, a moment where they were given something meaningful and couldn't meet it with the same depth. That realization doesn't come all at once. It builds gradually, often in quiet moments when there's nothing left to distract them. And when it fully lands, it's heavy, because now, it's not about what you did or didn't do. It's about what they failed to recognize and what they may never get back. That's the weight of absence. It doesn't chase, it doesn't argue, it doesn't explain. It simply exists. And in doing so, it forces truth to surface. And by the time they fully understand your value, they're no longer experiencing your presence. They're living with the consequences of losing it. And as that realization deepens, once the absence becomes undeniable, many avoidants attempt to solve the discomfort in the only way they know how. They replace instead of repair. They move toward new connections, new faces, new conversations, believing that something fresh will quiet what feels unresolved. On the surface, it can look like progress. It can even look like happiness. But internally, something doesn't align, because connection is not built on novelty. It's built on depth. And depth requires presence, vulnerability, and emotional availability, the very things they've struggled to sustain. So, what happens? The new relationship begins, but it doesn't feel the way they expected. There's interaction, there's attraction, there may even be moments of excitement, but something is missing. Not in the other person necessarily, but in their own capacity to engage fully. And this is where karma becomes more psychological than situational. They start to notice that the connection feels thin. Conversations don't carry the same weight. Emotional moments don't land the same way. There's a lack of resonance they can't quite explain. And without realizing it, they begin comparing, not always consciously, but internally, quietly, consistently. They compare how understood they felt before versus now. How natural things used to flow versus how much effort it takes to recreate that same sense of ease. And what they begin to recognize is something deeply uncomfortable. The connection they walked away from had a level of authenticity that cannot be manufactured on demand. This is the paradox. Avoidants often leave depth in search of relief, but end up finding emptiness instead. And it's not because the new person isn't good enough. It's because unresolved emotional patterns don't reset with new circumstances. Wherever you go, your internal framework goes with you. So if you haven't developed the ability to open, to trust, to engage with emotional complexity, you will recreate the same distance no matter who stands in front of you. Over time, this creates a quiet dissatisfaction, not dramatic, not always visible, but persistent. A sense that something is off, that what they have doesn't feel like what they lost. And this is where memory becomes more than nostalgia. It becomes contrast. They start remembering not just you, but how they felt with you, the level of emotional safety, the familiarity, the unspoken understanding. And now those memories don't feel distant. They feel specific, measurable, almost tangible in comparison to what they're experiencing in the present. And here's the deeper psychological layer. When you lose something meaningful due to your own inability to meet it, the mind doesn't just let it go. It revisits it, analyzes it, and in many cases idealizes it. Not because it was perfect, but because it represented something real. That realization can be disorienting, because now they're faced with a contradiction. They left to avoid discomfort, yet here they are, still uncomfortable. They sought something easier, yet what they found feels less fulfilling. And for the first time, they're forced to consider that the issue was never just the relationship. It was their relationship with vulnerability itself. This is where karma becomes experiential. It's no longer about what happened. It's about what continues to happen. The pattern repeating, the emotional distance persisting, the inability to create something meaningful, not because the opportunity isn't there, but because the internal capacity hasn't changed. And eventually, that awareness becomes unavoidable, because you can only distract yourself for so long before you start questioning why nothing feels the way it should. And that's the moment of truth, because it's one thing to lose someone. It's another to realize you may not yet have the capacity to build something like that again. And that realization stays with you. And when that awareness settles in, when the distractions no longer work, when new connections fail to replicate what was lost, something begins to shift at a deeper level. The ego, which once acted as a shield, starts to weaken. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, under the weight of undeniable truth. Because the ego thrives on control. It protects the narrative that says, I was right, I didn't lose anything significant, I can walk away without consequence. It reframes the past to avoid discomfort, often minimizing the value of what was given and exaggerating the reasons for leaving. And for a period of time, that narrative feels convincing. It creates emotional distance. It allows them to move forward without confronting themselves. But the problem with false narratives is that they don't hold up under sustained reality. Once the emotional numbness cracks, once your absence becomes real, once new experiences fail to deliver the same depth, those internal justifications begin to collapse. The story they told themselves no longer aligns with what they're feeling. And that's where something far more difficult begins to emerge. Regret. Not surface-level regret, not the kind that passes in a moment, but reflective, persistent regret, the kind that forces a person to revisit their own decisions with honesty. They start replaying moments, conversations, opportunities where they could have responded differently, shown up more fully, chosen connection over distance. And this is where the shift becomes undeniable. Because now, it's no longer about you, it's about them. They begin to recognize patterns in their own behavior, the way they pulled back when things became real, the way they avoided difficult conversations, the way they protected themselves at the cost of something meaningful. And for the first time, those actions are no longer justified, they're understood. That's a hard place to sit in. Because awareness removes the ability to pretend. Once you see your role clearly, you can't unsee it. And the ego doesn't like that. It resists accountability because accountability requires humility. It requires admitting, I didn't handle this well. I lost something not because it wasn't valuable, but because I wasn't ready to value it. That realization carries weight, not just emotionally, but psychologically, because it challenges identity. It forces a person to question how they see themselves versus how they actually showed up. And here's where karma operates in a very precise way. It doesn't accuse, it reveals. It reveals the gap between intention and action, between what they believed about themselves and what their behavior demonstrated. And that gap becomes the source of discomfort, not because someone else is pointing it out, but because they can now see it on their own. Over time, that discomfort turns into reflection. And reflection, when it's honest, leads to a kind of internal confrontation most avoidants spend their lives trying to escape. They begin asking questions they once avoided. Why did I pull away? Why did I sabotage something that mattered? Why do I struggle to stay when things become real? These are not easy questions. They don't have quick answers, but they mark the beginning of something important, self-awareness. And with self-awareness comes a quieter, more grounded form of regret. Not loud, not reactive, but steady. The understanding that something meaningful was lost, and that loss cannot simply be undone. Because by the time the ego steps aside, reality has already taken its place. And reality doesn't negotiate. It doesn't rewrite the past to make it more comfortable. It simply presents what is, the connection that existed, the choice that was made, and the consequence that followed. At that point, there's no one left to blame, no narrative left to hide behind, just a clear, unfiltered understanding of what happened and why. And that's when regret stops being a passing emotion and becomes a lasting lesson, because in the end, the ego may protect you in the moment, but it will cost you in the long run. And once regret settles in, quiet, persistent, and undeniable, it doesn't always lead to immediate action. In fact, for someone with avoidant tendencies, direct action is often the hardest step, because reaching out, being honest, or attempting to repair what was broken requires vulnerability. And vulnerability is exactly what they've spent a lifetime trying to manage, control, or avoid altogether. So instead of stepping forward, they stay at a distance. This is where something subtle but revealing begins to happen. They start watching, not openly, not in a way that invites conversation, but quietly from the background. They check your social media, they notice changes, they pay attention to your growth, your happiness, your movement forward. Sometimes they ask about you indirectly through mutual connections. Sometimes they revisit old messages, old photos, old moments that once felt ordinary but now carry a different weight. And what's important to understand here is that this behavior isn't sluchiny, it's psychological. Because distance allows them to feel without being seen. It gives them access to connection without requiring exposure. They can observe your life, your progress, your absence, while still maintaining the emotional safety of not having to engage directly. It's a controlled form of closeness, one that doesn't demand accountability. But even in that distance, something begins to shift. They start to see you differently, not through the lens of the past where they minimize your value, but through the lens of absence, growth, and clarity. They see what you've become without them. They see that you didn't collapse, that you didn't stay stuck, that you continued moving forward. And in many cases, they see you becoming stronger, more grounded, more aligned with yourself. That realization can be deeply confronting because it challenges another quiet assumption they once held, that you would remain emotionally available, that you would somehow stay within reach, that the door they walked away from would remain open indefinitely. But now, as they observe from a distance, they begin to sense something different, a shift in your energy, a detachment, a boundary. And that's when the weight of their decision becomes more real than ever. Because now it's not just about what they lost, it's about what they can no longer access. They may feel the urge to reach out, to say something, to reconnect in some way. But that urge is often met with hesitation. Questions arise. What would I say? Would they even respond? Have I waited too long? And beneath all of that is a deeper fear, not just of rejection, but of being seen clearly. Because reaching out would require them to confront everything they've been observing from a distance. It would require honesty, ownership, vulnerability. And those are not small steps for someone who has built their identity around emotional self-protection. So they remain in that space, watching, thinking, feeling, but not acting. And here's where karma operates in a way that is both subtle and profound. It places them in a position where they are emotionally engaged, but structurally disconnected. They feel the pull of connection, but they lack the courage or the readiness to move toward it. And that internal tension doesn't resolve easily, because the more they watch, the more they understand. And the more they understand, the more they feel the distance they created. It becomes a kind of silent confrontation, not with you directly, but with the reality of what they let go of and what it would now take to even attempt to return. And for many, that distance becomes permanent, not because the feeling isn't there, but because the capacity to act on it hasn't fully developed. So they stay on the outside, looking in, aware, reflective, but still held back by the very patterns that created the separation in the first place. And that's the quiet weight of this stage. Because it's one thing to lose access to someone. It's another to realize you're the one who closed the door, and now you don't know how to knock. And when all of this unfolds, when the numbness cracks, when your absence becomes undeniable, when new connections feel empty, when regret replaces ego, and even distance no longer protects them from what they feel, something deeper comes into focus. Not just a moment of realization, but a pattern that extends beyond you, beyond this one experience, and into the way they relate to life itself. Because at some point, it becomes impossible to ignore that the issue isn't situational, it's behavioral. It's not just about one relationship that didn't work. It's about a consistent way of responding to emotional closeness, a tendency to withdraw when things become meaningful, a habit of choosing safety over connection, control over vulnerability. And this is where karma moves from being an emotional experience to a structural one. They begin to see repetition, different people, similar outcomes, different beginnings, same endings. The initial excitement, followed by subtle discomfort, followed by distance, followed by disconnection. And for a while, it's easy to attribute that pattern to external factors, timing, compatibility, circumstances. But eventually, that explanation stops holding. Because when the same result keeps showing up, the variable is no longer the environment, it's the individual. This realization can be unsettling, not because it's dramatic, but because it's precise. It removes ambiguity. It brings clarity to something they may have spent years avoiding. The understanding that their approach to emotions is not just protecting them, it's limiting them. And limitations over time come with consequences. They start to feel it in subtle ways at first. A lack of depth in conversations, a sense of disconnection even when they're not alone, an inability to fully engage with moments that should feel meaningful. It's not that opportunities for connection disappear, it's that their ability to step into those opportunities remains restricted. And that restriction becomes more noticeable as time goes on, because human beings are wired for connection, not surface level interaction, but real, grounded, emotionally present connection. And when that need isn't met, not because it's unavailable, but because it's avoided, it creates an internal imbalance. A quiet dissatisfaction that doesn't always have a clear source, but is felt nonetheless. This is the long-term consequence of emotional avoidance. It doesn't always show up as chaos. More often, it shows up as absence. The absence of depth, the absence of fulfillment, the absence of something that feels real. And eventually they're faced with a choice, not a dramatic external decision, but an internal one. Continue operating within the same patterns, accepting the limitations that come with them, or begin the difficult process of change. And change, in this context, is not about finding the right person. It's about becoming the kind of person who can stay present when things become real. That requires confronting discomfort instead of escaping it. It requires learning how to sit with emotion instead of shutting it down. It requires a level of self-awareness and accountability that cannot be bypassed. Because the truth is simple. Even if it's not easy, you cannot experience the depth of connection you avoid. And this is where karma completes its cycle. Not as punishment, not as revenge, but as a mirror, reflecting back the exact patterns that have been repeated, the exact choices that have been made, and the exact consequences that follow. It doesn't force change, but it makes the cost of staying the same impossible to ignore. And in that moment, everything becomes clear, because sooner or later, everyone reaches a point where they have to decide. Continue running from what's real, or finally turn and face it. And when you step back and look at the entire journey, from the emotional numbness, to the weight of your absence, to the emptiness of new connections, to the quiet emergence of regret, to the distance they maintain while watching you, and finally to the realization of their own repeating patterns, you begin to understand something powerful. Karma is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't chase, argue, or try to prove a point. It reveals. It reveals truth over time. It reveals what was taken for granted. It reveals the cost of avoidance, the price of emotional withdrawal, and the long-term consequences of choosing comfort over growth. And most importantly, it reveals people to themselves. Because in the end, this was never just about what they did to you. It's about what they now have to face within themselves. The patterns they can no longer deny, the emotions they can no longer suppress, the reality they can no longer escape. And here's where your power comes in. Your role was never to teach them a lesson. Your role was never to wait for their realization. Your role was to grow, to heal, and to move forward with clarity and self-respect. Because while karma works on them internally, your responsibility is to continue evolving externally and internally without looking back. You don't need their regret to validate your worth. You don't need their realization to confirm your value. And you certainly don't need their return to complete your journey. Because the truth is, what they lost, you became stronger, clearer, more grounded, more aligned with what you deserve. And while they may still be processing, reflecting, and confronting the consequences of their choices, you are no longer in that cycle. You've moved beyond it. So let karma do what it does best, quietly, consistently, and without permission. And you keep moving forward. Because in the end, the greatest closure is not their understanding. It's your transformation.